Gary Wayne, it is so good to finally get you on Encounter today.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and so happy to be here today, and looking forward to talking with you and your audience, and hopefully going to places where people maybe haven't, looked at as close as maybe I would like to see them have a look at. But the whole idea is to create some curiosity and to get you to dig deeper into the Bible.
Yeah, no question. And some of the subject matter we're going to get into is very, very controversial today, which is why I think we've gotten some of the kickback and warfare we've had to deal with trying to get on here. But I'm so excited to talk with you about this. Your first book, which I have here,
Yeah. Yeah.
The Genesis 6 Conspiracy, kind of blew my mind. I got to be real honest. I wrote a little bit about kind of what you talk about in my book, Summoning the Demon, but no, not to this extent, ladies and gentlemen. This is 800 pages. And the new book, The Genesis 6 Conspiracy Part 2, I learned my lesson because I got the ebook, because this overexceeded, there it is, the weight capacity when I tried to get on a plane. Look at that.
The only thing
Outstanding.
the only thing I guaranteed about book 2 was it would be shorter than book 1, and it is, but only about 60 pages shorter. So
Which is a drop in the bucket. So
yeah.
let's go back to book 1, because book 1 is a little bit different than book 2, which is fascinating. How you've researched and really dove into this is really unique, I think, to you, in the sense that book 1 shows how the world system that we currently live in, including secret societies, where I want us to dive into, intersect with the biblical narrative. And so let's start there. You know at the top of your mind that there are secret societies that we're going to talk about in this broadcast, but I want us to begin with Genesis 6, because the book makes the case that in Genesis 6, that's the beginning of these secret societies. So let's go back to Genesis 6, and as if no one in our audience has heard anything about this, where did all of this come from?
Well, yeah, I never thought I would write a book like this. I was just wanting to do research on prophecy, and I would just put out some prophecy books. And so that was what I thought. I didn't even know whether I could publish, but when I decided to see whether I could get published, I wanted to sort of connect some of these eerie things that are talked about in Genesis 6 and other things that come up throughout the Old Testament, like demons and fallen angels and whatever these giants were, which just sent me for a loop and a half when I first ran across it. I was just basically saying, whatever that is, that's not what I'm here to do. But as I was doing the research for prophecy, and you got to go through so many times to get it all, I kept seeing giants. So I wanted to connect to see whether I could do a narrative, could I connect the giants, demons, fallen angels to end time prophecy. And because a lot of that shows up from
Yes.
a complete literal aspect. And could you also connect in the giants somehow within that? And so that's how it began. And so I had to do a lot more research on Genesis 6. For people who aren't familiar with Genesis 6, this is the beginning of the flood story. And in the
Mhm.
preamble to the flood story is the creation of, depending on which English translation that you're referring to giants or Nephilim, as you would take that back to Hebrew. And it's really interesting because that term giant is really kind of controversial, as well as who the sons of God might be. And so the giants are, as I described, as Nephilim. I am is the male plural. So Nephil is the singular format, and it's rooted in another Hebrew word called Nephal, which means fallen, and I am for fallen ones. Just as you see Satan when he falls from heaven in Isaiah 14:12 to 13, you have that word fallen, that's Nephalim. So I am is the male plural, fallen ones. So the fallen ones are connected with the giant ones as it's described. And a lot of people might say, well, but it also in the definition says bull and tyrant. Well, those are descriptions of the giants. So if you go into the Ugaritic texts or most mythologies around the world, and you understand that there's now a connection here between some of the things that polytheism might talk about through a polytheist lens, and the Bible will talk about things through a monotheist lens. When we hear the term bulls of Bashan, that should catch our attention. So in polytheism, like the Baalim in the Bible, as the Ugaritic text records them, where the gods were talked about as bulls, and so were the giants. only the giants are demigods. They're the offspring of the gods and human females. And so this is the tribes of the Titanu that I talk about in book 2. The assembly of the Titanu that answers to the Council of Gods, talked about in Psalms 82 and through Deuteronomy 32 and Exodus 1:5, just to make some links in terms of the 70 nations that they governed over both before and after the flood. And so when we start to understand that bully is one of the terms to describe a giant, then we can also look at tyrannos or tyrant. And this originally originates through the Anatolian Indo-Aryan merging of Semitic languages that becomes the Hittite language of Tarwanos, of these bloodline kings created by the gods. And then we see that with the Gyges kings in Greek history and secular history, where they had dynastic kings that were in Assyria, they were in Asia Minor, they were through southern Greece. And these are the bloodlines, or the Herculidi kings, from the bloodline of Hercules, who is the offspring after the flood of Zeus and Alcmene, which is a human female. So you have these dynastic bloodlines associated with these tyrants that people refer to as the tyrants being talked about in Ezekiel 32, which doesn't really say tyrant, but it means terrible ones, as you take that back to Hebrew, the Eritim. And so all the words in there describe giants because they were the ruling class. And so bringing that back to full circle in Genesis 6, we have the creation of giants through the sons of God. And it's in the preamble to the flood story. It's the context for the flood story. By extension, it is where the violence and the corruption comes from, for the most part, at least on the steroid aspect, or pressing the gas pedal down once that they're created, that leads the world into war. And if not for the flood, would probably have been destroyed by the angelic technology that was delivered to the Nephilim. And just as we have the days of Noah as part of the overarching signs, and we're just now starting to catch up to that sort of technology. So who are the sons of God? Well, a lot of people say they're Sethites. And that makes sense from a sort of superficial understanding, and that but Sethites couldn't produce something that's supernatural like giants. These things were monstrous. Not just 7 feet tall or 8 feet tall. The antediluvian giants were likely 20 to 40 feet tall. And the post-diluvian giants, as we get Og's dimension in his bed, he'd be 12 to 15 feet tall. And Goliath, 6 cubits and a span on a royal cubit as the king of Gath, he would have been 11 feet 3 inches, 9 on a standard cubit. So, and they were twice as wide, not twice as wide, but generally a human has a width to height ratio of 3 to 1. These were 2 to 1. And that's sort of referenced in the bed of King Og, where it is 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. And it was made of steel because it wouldn't hold his weight. And it was kept on display in Rabbah as a reminder to Israel that they didn't fight hybrids. They actually fought the actual giants in the land of the covenant.
So you make this distinction before we dig any deeper between the giants and hybrids, which is fascinating. What is the difference between the two?
So there's and I'll get to that in just a second. So
sure,
just
yes.
sons of God first,
yeah.
just so we finish that off, because I think when we talk about things particularly for Christians and biblically, we need to make sure that we're giving a proper reference for them. And so the sons of God in the Old Testament are portrayed in Job 1:6-1 and Job 38:4-7. And so you have these sons of God that are presenting themselves within the throne in heaven. And so these are understood as angels in other English translations. And this is the same term that is used, the sons of God, Ha Ben Elohim, of the tripart nature, or the sons of God would be understood of angels in that sort of understanding, just as the angels are created before creation in Psalms 104. So we have a creation of angels before the creation of humans, and it's these Nephilim of the Shemayim, the heavenly ones, Shemaim, that are the sons of God. And so people will say, well, that still doesn't mean that these are sons of God. They could be Sethites, and that could be a presentation of angels on earth somewhere. We don't get that biblically, but that's part of the argument that's sort of set forth. But then I go to 38, 4-7 in the book of Job. That's when the morning stars and the sons of God celebrated at the creation of the physical universe, and humans couldn't be there. And then some people will point to the Old Testament and say, well, Israel was the son of God.
Hmm.
But that's an allegory, because we know Israel as a nation isn't a son of God, right? And we know the genealogies where Israel comes from. But when you look at that word Israel, that is the name that Jacob adopts. And it's a compound word that means, in this case, Ben, son of Israel, of the ruling God. And so that's understood as a prophetic thing for the nation of Israel that's going to happen in the end time. So when you see children of God in the book of Isaiah and Hosea, that's an end time prophecy for the second Exodus, where it's in preparation for them to be ruling from Jerusalem with Jesus and with the Christian church throughout the millennium. So those references are more end time than they are Old Testament. So then people will say, well, sons of God are said to be Christians in the New Testament, and we are, but there's a process there. It's an adoption process, even though we have human
Yeah.
fathers versus angelic fathers. After the resurrection, we will be raised to be like angels. And so I deal with all of that, and even go even in more detail in that from a Christian perspective in book 2. And that some people will also say, but angels are spirits. Well, that's correct too. But in my approach to scripture and prophecy is that you have to be including all of the passages in the Bible and then put that together. You can't leave out sort of inconvenient passages. So in the New Testament, in Hebrews 13, we're told to be careful as we deal with strangers, lest we run across an angel and be unaware of that. So that suggests they can take a physical form and pass off as a human and not be recognized as angels. And we see that in Genesis 18, when Jehovah of the Elohim takes a physical form, and two angels take a physical form. And at first, Abraham doesn't realize that these are from heaven and that they are men, in sort of how he describes them, and says that they are men. And then he realizes that they are angels. So they have an ability to be recognized or not, because when these two physical angels in a physical body go to Sodom and Gomorrah, they're recognized instantly as angels in a human form. You also have an angel in a human form when Jesus is raised and standing at the cave at the rolled open tomb after the resurrection that Mary encounters. And I won't go through all of it, but we have a lot of passages in the Bible where angels can take a human form, and we see them in other forms as well. So how they do that is through an understanding of an oiketerion, which is the word habitation and house in heaven. Jude 1:6 for habitation, and house in heaven in 2 Corinthians 5:2. And it means a dwelling place for the spirit. So they left their dwelling place for their spirit in heaven, just as we long for our dwelling place for our spirit in heaven. And they require a soul and a body to interact physically in the physical world. They can be here as a spirit, but to interact physically, they need to create their own oiketerion. And if you create that soul and a body that the spirit from heaven merges with, then you can pass on that DNA. So both books will cover all of that off, but it's important to sort of understand that you can make this odd narrative in the preamble to the flood story make sense biblically just as it's written. And once you start to put all of the passages together, you don't have to start twisting scripture like a pretzel to make it sort of fit a preconceived belief system.
Yeah, no question. And it's interesting when you read your book and you begin to see the different words that are used, that it's not always Nephilim, it's not always giants, it's not something that you would recognize. There are certain tribes, there are certain people that I want you to walk us through that. How do we identify when these Nephilim, these giants, are being spoken of in the Word of God?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So, and I think the other question you had was the difference between uh,
The
hybrid
hybrids, yeah, and the
and the giants. And so, before the flood, and I talk about this extensively in book one, they had the ability to produce in great numbers. And in some of the polytheist versions, and I always let the polytheists and the seculars speak for themselves, so their words, they can't say I'm twisting their words. And then I say, okay, this is where it strays from the Bible, and I measure everything against what the Bible says. And that they were sort of just taking over the whole world with that ability to reproduce. And in Genesis 6:3, we're told about God's going to limit life to 120 years. And that's the physical body side, so that these will become the disembodied spirits once that physical body dies. And so that was God's answer right in the creation of the Nephilim, in the preamble to the flood story, as the context for what's causing the violence for the flood, that he limits that. And so there's something that's different from the giants after the flood, and that they don't have the same sort of reproductive capability. And in that word terrible ones in Ezekiel 32, these are the terrible ones talking from the sides of the pit. And these are the Gibor ones talking from the sides of the pit. Gibor meaning mighty, Gibborim being mighty ones, just as the giants are described in Genesis 6:4. But there's also the strong ones, which is mighty, mighty strong ones, the word El in Hebrew, that are in the middle of the pit prison. So these are the terrible ones that are the Gibor. These are the giants who were slain while they're on earth, as Ezekiel 32 talks about. And they're talking to another mighty one, Pharaoh. It's a sort of an archetype antichrist type figure, in how that prophecy plays out for the time of the prophet, and some end time implications as well. It provides important prehistory for us, and that word erit, eritim, has within its very large set of meanings a fertility issue. And so something changes between the post-diluvian giants than the antediluvian giants, and that's that ability to reproduce. And I think it comes through with less females, which is why the matriarchal bloodline becomes so important to start new dynasties through the royales, or the kings of God, as in the polytheist gods as royale. As you take that back to raw king, ruler, Latin, and a regal Latin, and rule Indo-Aryan, the language of the Nephilim. And uh, Al is a transliteration of El in Hebrew for an angel or a god. So kings of God. I call them Rex Deus, or kings of God, which is sort of a Latin term for the same cognate term. And these are the ones that are going to have to make a choice after the flood, the post-diluvian giants. And they're either going to go extinct because they can't produce enough, or they're going to have to intermarry with humans and dilute those bloodlines. Um, and they do, and that's where you get the hybrids from. And so we get a very good example of that in Genesis 36. And I talk about this in great detail in book one, and I also will cover it in a different way in book two, specifically for Christians. Is that you have Esau, brother of Jacob, who lost his birthrights, blessings, and messianic promise as the firstborn son. He's going to marry Oholibama, Horim, and his son Eliphaz is going to marry Timnah, a Horim. Horim in Deuteronomy 2 are described as giants. That's the Hebrew word Rapha. I am is the male plural for Raphaim. Raphaim tend to be the post-diluvian giants, and Nephilim tend to be the Nephilim giants, but I leave a small crack open that some of the giants could survive somehow, some way, with the intervention of their celestial mafia godfathers, as I like to call them. Um,
Celestial Mafia Godfathers.
yes.
So are you suggesting an unbroken line, or are you saying a resurgence, or do you make the case, kind of share what both possibilities are?
Yeah, I leave open that they can survive somehow, some way with the help of the angels, either on another ark, as is told throughout polytheist cultures around the world, in the earth, off the earth, in another dimension, in stasis, however the angelic technology would make that available. I think it fits better for a second incursion. And in this case, biblically, the Baalim would be the fathers of the Rephaim, would be Baal and Anat creating those giants versus the parent gods before the flood, which would have been uh, El and Ashtaroth before the flood that would have created the Nephilim. And so Raphael is kind of one of the other names for Baal in the occult. And angels would have many names, just as kings would have many names and titles. And that seemingly is the eponymous name for Raphaim that shows up as a tribe in Genesis 14 and Genesis 15, in the War of Giants, and in the land that Abraham is being promised that's going to be bequeathed to him and his descendants. That includes the mighty seven that has the Rephaim, and then what I call the mighty 10 that has the ancient triple K in there. And so when we're looking at these Rephaim giants after the flood, is they're forced to intermarry to survive, and they're going to use, as I said earlier, mentioned earlier, a human patriarch and a bloodline female to start a new dynasty. So in Genesis 36, Eliphaz, son of Esau, is going to marry Timnah, son of Seir the Horim, the giant mentioned. And so you start this new dynasty, and they're going to produce a son that they're going to name Amalek and name him eponymously after a tribe of giants, the Amalekim versus the Amalekites, which will be the hybrids. And then they're going to move from Mount Seir area to the Petra area where the Amalekites or the Malakim were living. And we know the Amalekim were around before the Amalekites because they show up in the giant wars in Genesis 14. And so they predate the creation of Amalek by a couple hundred years and several generations. So there's a distinction between these two. And of course, you have this mixture of giants that are going to wait for Israel to come out of Egypt, and they're going to try and wipe Israel from the face of the earth so that they can inherit through Israelite law the blessings, the inheritance, and the Messianic promise, and put a dragon Messiah on the world throne.
Wow, and this is where we're going to dovetail in a minute into the secret societies and how they originated. I want to ask you about the giant wars as well, but you mentioned something. I had to grab this off of my desk. I was just recently in Turkey, and I was going to the location of the seven churches, and in Ephesus particularly, they worship the goddess Artemis, which I have
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
statue of her. Everyone who went into the city would buy one of these statues. And you mentioned a couple things as you were talking that brought this to mind. Number one, you mentioned let the polytheists speak and listen to what they say. Polytheism, and you talk about in your book the Canaanite pantheon, which I think would be interesting to parallel that with uh, what we're facing today. But if you see around her neck, there's all these bull testes. You mentioned bulls. You mentioned fertility. How does that tie in to like the worship of Artemis and what they were dealing with even in the New Testament when Paul is going into Ephesus and John and
Yeah.
Timothy?
So when the parent gods disappear, offspring gods take over. In polytheism, they kill the parent gods, but you can't kill something immortal. Only God Most High could do that if it were possible, but he has created the lake of fire where they're going to be punished forever. And so they were sent to the abyss. So they moved up in replacement, and they inherit the mythos and the titles of the parent gods before. So that's the fallen host. Host is the Hebrew word Saba, which means an army, and that has rank and order. And so in an army, if you lost your top leaders, you'd have ones that would be promoted up, and that's what happens. And so they are going to inherit the bull cult that started before the flood, and the sun cult that was created before the flood. And that's the pantheon that the Baalim are going to be promoting and having their followers worship that pantheon of gods, this time with the offspring gods of the Baalim, as they're recorded in the New Testament. And Baalim is the plural of Baal. So there's multiple uh, gods within that assembly on Mount Hermon, Mount Saphon, as it's called in the Ugaritic text, or Mount Zion, or Sirion, or Shinir, as all the different sort of transliterations. And Mount Hermon actually gets its name changed to Mount Hermon because of the oath of Haram anathema to carry out, no matter the consequences, the accursed oath of Mount Hermon, which is the Hebrew word haram, which Hermanim comes from as a derivative word out of haram for that curse or that oath. And so, yeah, you have all of this imagery that's coming forward into the post-Diluvian period, which I cover how the polytheists say it came about. I'm more comfortable with a second incursion, and that the fallen angels are going to teach that religion to their followers and their spurious offspring. But like I say, I do leave that small crack open. I think second incursion fits better in the Bible, but there's a couple of words that you could use as a legal basis in the flood story, that God brought the flood to destroy everything He created. He did not create the giants; fallen angels did. And God is also Alpha Omega, so He knew that they were going to create giants after creating um, humans, and then He knew that they would intercede to save some if they were to be saved. And so God is greater than free choice, and He's letting all of this play out. And so I find that a tight legal argument, and that's why I leave a small crack. But second incursion fits best because you have the Baalim that are talked about in the Bible, and then you have these Rapiu, RPM, original Semitic, in the Ugaritic text, where the Hebrew Semitic language is sort of a derivative out of that original Semitic language, and you can match words up. So the original word for Rephaim would be RPM, as it would show up in the original vowelless Ugaritic text. They're translated as Rapiu or Rapium, and then the H is kind of inserted. So just as you might see Nephilim will have Nepal as the original sort of Hebrew before, after the vowels are inserted, that would be NPL without the H, or NOP, EL, and variations of that as it's transliterated, but no H in there. That's an evolving part of the language of Hebrew. Would be the same for how Raphaim shows up, and that H is inserted. So, Raphael, as we said, one of the names for Baal, one of his titles, that would fit perfectly with that as you take that back into its history.
So you're making the case that this wasn't just, some angel flippantly sinning, fallen angel flippantly sinning, that this incursion was a deliberate and long thought out strategy in order to overthrow the plan of God for this planet, for humanity. So, can you walk us through a quick timeline? Number one, are there secret organizations that are operating today trying to implement the Antichrist agenda? If so, who are they, and how do you connect them to that Genesis 6 conspiracy?
Yeah, so let's first of all begin with that the fallen angels know the power of El Elyon, God Most High. And so they create the spurious offspring so that they'll use them and their followers to sort of get the blood on their hands, so the fallen angels don't. And so they're going to have them do all of the crimes against humanity.
Hmm.
And so, as we look at that kind of understanding, there would be the visible ones for the invisible ones. So, and you would have a similar sort of rank and order that's established on the earth, and beginning with the royales, the bloodline kings that would create the original ancient Masonic uh, bloodlines and secret societies. So, how we start to sort of connect that is well, when did secret societies start, and how did they start? And so probably the best source goes back to the people in the secret societies who wrote their own history, right, in the Polychronicon for the Masons. And as it comes down in the book that I use, The History of Freemasonry by Albert Mackey, an adept Freemason in the 1800s. And he took those legends out of this originally oral tradition of what's called the Polychronicon. And so in that, they take the beginnings of secret societies back to before the flood. And they take the beginnings back to Cain, and the knowledge that he learned from Adam, and is what they portray Adam as. He was fed all of this knowledge to run this huge agricultural area that went from the Nile to the Euphrates, same land piece that Abraham is promised after the
Mm.
flood for his descendants. And, basically from Mount Hermon to, the Sea of Aqaba and the Red Sea and all of the waters leading into the Indian Ocean. And you have the four rivers that you can take two of them back to the Nile and the Euphrates in Genesis 2. And so it would take a lot of knowledge for one person to do this, and maybe even some technology to do it. Because as you take the words back into Hebrew, he's raising crops and orchards and raising herds of domesticated animals. He's actually naming or renaming all of the animals depending on how you want to look at that in terms of some of his functions. And God finally sort of says, "Well, I'll give you a little bit of help. We'll give you Eve from your rib." But still, you only have two people. So the what they deduce is that God had to give them a lot of knowledge. And so that knowledge was then passed on to Cain, Abel, and Seth as the first of the three sons, after Adam and Eve were ostracized. So Abel is killed. Seth is born later. Cain goes to Nod, takes a wife, and starts to build a city, and marries a woman there, and his name is going to be called Enoch. And one of the things to understand world history, and what the polytheists say is we have to understand the Bible better, because they like to conflate this Enoch son of Cain with Enoch son of Jared in the Sethian line.
Right.
And
There's
so
a good Enoch and a bad Enoch.
so when you first started reading the book, I'm kind of trying to get under your skin a little bit as we're talking about Enoch, because I want to underline how important it is to understand this. And by the time you get a few chapters in, you realize there's two different Enochs. And it's amazing how many Christians don't know that. And that Enoch is the one who inherits the knowledge from Cain and puts it into 7 disciplines that we know as the 7 liberal arts today. Back then, it's the 7 sacred sciences. And from there, he's going to create a religion to keep it away from the Sethites, as they're going to develop this knowledge. And he creates the sun cult and the bull cult, what I call Enochian mysticism before the flood. And this is the religion that's going to mix with the knowledge from the fallen angels, as the book of Enoch talks about, or in secular history and polytheist history, that the knowledge comes from the gods for civilization, that puts it on steroids, so to speak, and sets it on a technology increase we haven't seen since our generation. And we may be witnessing the same ramping up of that type of technology, with the same liberal arts that are being taught that would be merging with angelic technology, as in the days of Noah. And that through the development of this knowledge, they develop mystery schools to teach the elite, because they create the 4-class system, both before and after the flood. So the royals populate the first 2 classes. That's the complete governing class of the kings and all of the rulers. And with their extended larger family, they occupy the ruling class of the priesthood or the religions, of the teaching class, of the warrior class for the armies, and all the large trading that's going to happen. The bottom 2 classes are made up of a small merchant class of bakers or blacksmiths that could eke out a meager living, and then the rest is a slave class, labor class, and ritual sacrifice class of the ancient polytheist religions. And so this is going to not only merge with angelic technology, but it's going to merge into the organizational structure of the antediluvian world. And the implementation of this religion that's imposed over the whole world. So you have these spirits, offspring of the celestial mafia godfathers, that are at the top of the religion and this organized religion. And these are what we would understand through the New Testament are antediluvian beast empires
Mm,
versus the beast empires after the flood. And that in these mystery schools, that's where the secret societies take their beginnings from. So they extend out of the mystery schools from the elite that's being taught this knowledge to develop all of these different sciences. And we even see that today, where you have Beta House, Alpha House, whatever. And then in the Ivy Leagues, you have like Skull and Bones and other ones for the bloodlines. And so it's the same model that's been around right since the beginning. So in Freemasonry, that's their beginning. And their greatest patriarchs are Enoch, Cain, Lamech of the Cain line versus the Seth line, Tubal Cain, Nama, Jubal, and Jubal. And so all of those names are listed biblically
mm,
because they were part of this renaissance of this Enochian technology in the time that the giants are created. And so you see all of this coming together. And that if you look at this angelic technology, it has planet destroying capabilities, just as we're starting to get to. So one of the things that I'll reference in book two is two 2 Peter 3, where it's talking about, where they're saying, where is this coming? And it goes into this really interesting set of passages that, that knowledge has sort of been forgotten and lost. And that, there was a world that was in the water, that was out of the water, that's in the water, that perished. Well, that's really strange because most people say, well, that's referencing to the flood story. I'm going, yes, but it wasn't destroyed by fire as it's being talked about here. That's reserved for the end time as part of this passage. And that the flood didn't kill the whole earth or the whole world, just the land. So you still had life that was still in the seas. And so it can't be really affecting that. But it's talking, I think, about a destruction that would have been probably in the angelic wars, um, that came that caused the earth to be destroyed down to its foundations. And in Psalms 104, we have in that addition to Genesis 1 as more information to it, you have the Holy Spirit, and this is the passage that talks about the creation of the angels as well, and has more days 1 through 6 information. It says that when God sends His Spirit, the earth is renewed, and of course we see in Genesis 1:2 the Spirit hovering over the chaotic waters. And what's happened here when you start putting that together is there might have been a destruction between Genesis 1:1 and 2. And I have a great document on this for people if want to get a hold of me. I'll walk it through the Hebrew and the Greek for the New Testament and what the words mean and how you can retranslate very easily that the world was not created formless and void.
right.
But that's the Hebrew word haya, which can mean became. And then you have to look at, how does something become ruined? How does something become formless? And that's the words tohu and buhu that are talking about this destruction that happens. And anyways, I won't relitigate all of that. But if you had destroyed in the angelic rebellion, where I'm sort of going, it might be a better place for it. Uh, the, that they implemented this angelic technology in that war, they could have destroyed the world down to its foundations. And then the waters above would have collapsed. So now when you get into the renewal of the earth, as Psalms 104 talks about, then you would have to separate those waters to create life on earth again, which becomes the firmament. And that's called heaven. In Genesis 1, and heaven is the Hebrew word shemayim, as we talked about before, as in heavenly ones with the plural. The singular is never used in the Old Testament. and that it can mean the firmament, as it's described in Genesis 1. It can mean what's outside the firmament, so outside where the sun is. And also, it's the dwelling place of God and the angels, right? So this can mean you have to make it fit. So if you're looking at Exodus 20:18, where it says that God created the earth in 6 days, heaven and earth, you can make that fit perfectly with a renewal of the earth understanding versus that's the original creation. So I know I got down a bit of a rabbit hole there, but
No, we don't mind rabbit holes.
they take that technology and I think they apply it, which sort of fits to what we're talking about, that God brings the water so that all the names in the book of life that were recorded in the book of life from before creation will have an opportunity to come forward and to have their name left in that book or have it blotted out if God doesn't intercede with the flood, and that destruction by fire was reserved to the end time. He's got to do something that achieves both. And so it doesn't stop the giants from showing up after the flood, but it provides more time so that all the names in the book of life could have a chance to choose God and eternity or the second death. And so all of this is going on in terms of understanding the organizational structure and the events and the creation of the secret societies that will become the Royale secret societies. And so this whole organizational structure and secret societies crosses the flood somehow. And so where monotheism and polytheism intersect again is Babel. And you have in the Masonic records, what they say is that Nimrod received the knowledge to build Babel City and Babel Tower. And biblically, we're not told where that knowledge comes from. And one would think Noah wouldn't be providing it because he witnessed what happened before the flood. He doesn't want to see that happen again. And so this comes from a person called Hermes, as we would understand it, Harmine and Harmenes, and a few different transliterations. And he finds the location to where the knowledge is stored based on a pillar that was designed to float versus one that was also, there was two pillars of Lamech or Enoch, depending on which version that you're talking about. And so it's the one obviously that would float survives because of the flood. And it has directions where this Enochian knowledge and religion was stored beneath the Great Pyramid in 9 vaults in 36,525 books. And there are 9 stories of these vaults stacked up. So he takes his knowledge back to Nimrod. He initiates 1,000 masons to build, and masonry is the 5th science of geometry as they understand it in the craft, to build Babel City and Babel Tower. And Nimrod imposes the Enochian mysticism from before the flood and becomes like an archetype. So Nimrod is now remembered as one of their greatest patriarchs as well, writing the first constitution for the ancient Masons. And so this is how the secret societies sort of crossed the flood. How we see secret societies coming about in the modern version is with not spending too much time on the history on it, is through the Knights Templars, which are formed from the Royales, and all of the original founding members are Royales, even the 2 Cistercian monks. They're related to all of these other Royales that have formed the Knights Templar. So Hugh de Payan, Godfrey de Bouillon, and the folk of Anjou are all from one region in France, in the Lorraine region, and they're Anjou. And they're believed to be the descendants of the Merovingians, who have multiple bloodlines, including Nephilim bloodlines, grafted into their royal dynastic bloodline. And so at the fall of the Templars, which grows to be this greatest organization, like, seen since the flood, they created modern banking. They had fortresses and locations at all the key strategic places across Europe. They were the best warriors. And when the church and the king of France rise up to take them down, probably more through greed and envy, not saying that Templars were good because they were all polytheists at the adept level, worshiping at that time, we would understand that polytheist religion as the Albigensians and the Cathars, which were in this sort of blood war for supremacy between the Roman Church and that version of polytheism. And so, what the Royals do after the fall of the Templars is they say, we're not going to leave that as one central organization. And they're going to start to create the organizations that we know today and create what I talked about in book 2 is the thelemic tree to understand that organizational structure. So, they're going to create Freemasonry, which is going to be the introductory level, and reinviting bloodline people back to this belief system and to achieve first level of adept. Above that is the Illuminati, which works at the adept level and uses the organizational structure of the Freemasons around the world to do their beckoning. And they're going to be higher than a third level or 33rd degree Scottish Rite as we would understand it. They would be 4 or 5. You have to be fifth level to oversee regional Masonic outlets. So as you move up the hierarchy, you're going up higher in the degrees. You have Rosicrucians that some people say goes up as high as 7 degrees in the old system. And that's the crossover between the rising ones that they brought back in of bloodline descendancy and the purebloods. And the purebloods are the Royals. So the top 50% is operated by the Royals, who take their genealogies back to a specific Nephilim or Raphaim and a celestial mafia godfather or a fallen angel. And that's who they swear their oath to, and that's who they receive that divine right to rule from. So when King Charles III takes an oath, you don't know whether he's taking that oath in the name of the God of the Bible or his specific celestial mafia godfather who
No, I
gives
have
him
to
that
ask you
divine.
this, by the way, because someone sent me an email saying that he is a direct descendant of um, who we know as Dracula,
Vlad
and
the
that he
Impaler.
actually is that true?
Well, that's what he said twice, and I can send people the links on it. He said it when he was still Prince. And that comes through understanding that the Windsors changed their name from Hanover because they were from the German bloodline who replaced the Stuart dynasty. And in World War I, for obvious reasons, they changed their name to Windsor, a more sort of English name, and that they were intermarrying through Central European bloodlines, which included the Vlad bloodline, which is the person Dracula is based on. And Vlad the Impaler was your typical noble Nephilim Tuatha De Danann fairy folk individual. He had red hair, hazel eyes, pale skin, and was educated at the mystical school of House of Solomon in Vienna. And as you take his bloodlines back, he traces his bloodlines back in their mythos back to a tribe of the Agrassi, which is the one of the tribes that Hercules produced. So part of that Herculidean Gyges bloodline, Tuatha De Danann Scythians, as I explained and linked those names together in book 1 and book 2, and that Hercules is the son of Alcmene, a human female, and Zeus, the parent god after the flood of the Greek belief system. And so yeah, that's what he says. I take my genealogy back to them. And he has other scion bloodlines in there to help with his ennobleness. But those are his words, not mine.
Okay,
So,
that's fascinating, and I want to ask you about other current leaders, Nephilim that are in existence today, and then in a moment, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to head over to the premium side. If you go to encountertoday.com and become a premium member, I want to ask him. He just mentioned fairy folk. I got to ask him about fairy folk. I got to ask him about the elven houses, reptilians, Atlantis. I don't know what we'll have time to get to, but if you want to get a hold of that part of the conversation, go right now to encountertoday.com and dive right in. So when we talk about modern secret societies, who are some other leaders? You mentioned Charles III. Who are some leaders that you see as operating in that? And
yeah,
are there Nephilim alive today? And if so, why aren't they 15 feet tall?
very good question. So, to answer that, understand that above the Rosicrucians are all of the bloodline royal orders. So, the Committee of 300 Families. Above that is the Council of 33 Families. And above that is the 13 families of the Western bloodlines, Western European bloodlines. And understand there's bloodlines all around the world. So now if we look at King Charles III, and he has his own Royal Masonic Order, as all the royals do at the top level, and branches that go down through those other organizations of purebloods, and through that thelemic trunk tree, as we talked about, with branches like a cedar of Lebanon. And I kid you not, that intersect like this, which were the allegory for the Amorites as giants, because they're the giant trees of the ancient world that all the temples and the palaces were formed from, and the roots go down to Hades, where they received their power from, where their gods live in Hades, Sheol, so in the earth in another dimension. And so other family bloodlines that we would want to keep an eye on in Western European families would be the Anjou that we mentioned earlier as part of the founders of the Knights Templar. So in 1118, in a small priory on a rock of Zion in Jerusalem, on that mountain, a new title is created. Even though there was Baldwin the First and de Bouillon who ruled before. But in 1118, he's officially crowned as the king of Jerusalem. And they get that through that scioning of bloodlines. And so they have Nephilim bloodlines. They have that they believe through the Merovingians, and this is their alleged, no, I don't believe this is just what they say, that they have bloodlines from Jesus and Mary Magdalene scioned in there. They have bloodlines of King David and King Saul in there, and it's through the King Saul bloodlines. And notice how they like to draft biblical patriarchs into everything and reimagine them in their polytheist belief system. And that King Saul is really important in terms of this King of Jerusalem title, because in the time of the Exodus, Joshua awards Jerusalem to the Benjamites. And of course, King Saul is a Benjamite king. And so through that, they claim Jerusalem as their inheritance, as where they want to put their dragon Messiah on, just as Antichrist will declare himself to be God in the temple in the end time, and the king of Jerusalem and the kingdom of heaven, just as that movie that was out a number of years about talks about these bloodlines. Trouble is, there's some intrigue that enters in. So through intermarriage and death and generations, you get three splits in this King of Jerusalem claim. The one who currently holds it today and recognized is the King of Spain, who is King Philippe Bourbon, who inherited the title King of Jerusalem from Juan Carlos, his father, and they inherited that through the Habsburg Lorraine dynasty, as that King of Jerusalem title passed down through the ages from 1118. And they inherited that with the Habsburg dynasty through intermarriage of the Anjou out of the Lorraine region, which is why you have the Habsburg Lorraine as a scioning of that dynasty in the titles. And that goes back, in history to the original Baldwin. But along the line, you have the Anjou of Naples and the kings of Italy through these intermarriages that they're having, because they intermarry like crazy. They make a claim to that King of Jerusalem title, even though they're not officially recognized it. And the von Habsburg, who's alive today, says he doesn't recognize King Philippe's right, that he should have the King of Jerusalem title. So they're fighting for the same title. And in their belief system, Antichrist will make his entrance through a large ark at Gezer Castle in Gezer Town. And he'll be called the Grand Monarch, but that's where he, in their mystical world, will make his introduction into the world. And Gezer Castle is a very important place because that's where the Priory of Sion, the seniors order, separates from the junior order. In 1118, when you had Baldwin II crown, Huda Payon becomes the separation in the junior order, still an adept for the Knights Templar. So you had the barons as the senior order that appointed the kings, who the Templars are also answer to, and then you have the Templars that are going to be disbanded in 1188 because they've lost Jerusalem in 1187. So the senior order, the priory, the barons, leave them and say, you've lost your way. That was your main focus. You're now just focused on banking and other things. And so they don't even come to their help. So it is this organization that's going to start the New Templars after the fall of the Templars, and they're going to first introduce the name the Rosicrucians. So it's important to sort of understand how that history sort of flows through. And there are other bloodlines in Europe that will make claims. And there's bloodlines around the world you should be aware of, like President Xi in China. He is a bloodline of the Western Shah dynasty, which was the original empires that communism overthrew. Just like communism overthrew the original Putyanin bloodline of Kiev, that was succeeded by a junior offshoot, the Romanovs, through intermarriage from the 1600s, but it's still the Putyanin bloodline that Vladimir the Great, that Putin honors and believes he has his bloodlines through that, through his grandfather was born in Kiev, through an illegitimate marriage, and then his father moved to Russia during World War I, and that's how he ends up in Russia. I'm not saying you can prove that, but that's his mythos that he had put out through the newspapers on his rise to power. And so you have Xi, who is dynastic orientated. You have Putin, who's dynastic orientated. And if we want to understand what's going around in geopolitics, we have to understand the influence of these royals who are working in behind the scenes as the sort of the invisible ones of the visible ones. So they work behind the scenes and they like to emulate themselves like a demigod or the invisible ones that rule from the council of the gods. So we need to understand that Jesus warned us that there would be multiple antichrists.
Mm-hmm.
And the epistles of John underlines that. And so we want to be careful not to point that King Charles is the Antichrist or one of the Anjous. We can look at possible candidates, but until he actually is crowned, you don't know who's going to be the Antichrist. And that's one of the ways I think the world really gets deceived, because if you're going to have an Antichrist deceive everybody in the world, he's got to fulfill and have a pedigree and the credentials promised to Jesus or done by Jesus. He's got to counterfeit all of that. So he's going to need a counterfeit Antichrist to defeat, just as Jesus defeats Antichrist at Armageddon. And this will require a counterfeit Armageddon war. And we do get that in prophecy. I won't spend a lot of time on it because it's a big explanation. But Ezekiel 38 and 39 in the Gog War is the Joel 1 and 2 war versus Armageddon in Joel 3, and is the Revelation 9 war.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, by the way. You make the case in the book that the Ezekiel 38 is that counterfeit Armageddon.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. I've never heard it put that way.
Yeah, it was hard to explain at the beginning why this is a different timing than Armageddon. And a lot of people, I understand why, they think it's either the war at the end of Revelation or it is actually Armageddon. Because Joel 1 and 2 says this is the largest army ever created or ever will be again. So one thinks, well, that has to be Armageddon. And we get this 200 million man army in Revelation 9. So people say, well, that's got to be Armageddon, because, I mean, you can't get an army bigger, and you don't. But what happens when you start to sort of look at scripture without other scripture, you start to lose the chronology that's being talked about. And so we know the Gog War is in the latter days. And that's understood, and that's Ezekiel 38, and that's understood to be the end time as it's used throughout the Old Testament. And then in Ezekiel 39, after the army is defeated, you get these really odd passages about second Exodus happening. This is something that's a second half of the last year event. It's the time of of Jacob's trouble, the Hebrew word sarah, cognate word for thlipses, for tribulation, and he's going to be saved out of it. It's the time of the second Exodus. And so if it happens before second Exodus, then it's got to be somewhere before the year of the Lord's favor and before the year of the Lord's wrath. And so now what else do we have for timing is that you have Revelation 9, where you have these creatures coming out of the abyss as part of the first woe. And that the ones that come out of the abyss, and one in particular, is going to be accountable for killing one of the two witnesses, or both of the two witnesses. So it has to be before the midpoint when this abyss is opened up, and that the 200 million man army isn't part of the first woe, isn't the second woe, but seems to be like an extension out of the first woe as you read that in a linear manner, which means that this army is going to have a connection with the fallen angels that are coming out, and a connection with the terrible ones that are in the pit prison, and the descriptions of the riders and the horses, if you can call them horses, that are going to be part of this army. And so Antichrist, when he comes to power, is also described as the one who comes up out of the abyss. So he has a relationship as the son of perdition with these creatures coming up out of the abyss. So all the details point to that being a war that Antichrist is going to take credit for. So this is that overwhelming army that's talked about in Daniel 11 that's swept away, that he's going to take credit for. And then he moves his armies into Jerusalem, as Daniel 11 and the book of Luke talks about, and creates the abomination.
Well, so much detail, which is why everybody has to get a copy of the book, The Genesis 6 Conspiracy, Part 1 and Part 2. The link is in the description of this video. I want to talk to you, do a rapid fire round about reptilians, fairy folk, Atlantis, all that kind of stuff. But Gary Wayne, other than the link in the description, how do people connect with you?
Yeah, the best way to get a hold of me is through my website, genesis6conspiracy.com. That's the Genesis 6, the number 6conspiracy.com. On that website, I have contact the author. So if you wanted to get that document on renewal of the earth, please do. If you want to get, just name a topic. If I have a document on it, I'll send it to you at no charge. So if you want a document on how we know demons are the disembodied spirits of giants, or if you want to know about second incursion, or you want the biblical case, how we know the sons of God, just name it by topic and I'll send you those. It might take me 2 months to get back to you. If you have a question, I'll answer your question. So don't send me videos. I don't have time to look at videos. But if you have,
please, yes, I can relate.
And
I've never been one who bought into that demons are disembodied spirits from a pre-Adamic race, but I'd love to read your information on that and check that out. So everybody needs to go to the website, because your website not only has your contact info, there's portions of chapters of the book that you can kind of read and get previews of. You can kind of go through the table of contents and get all that information. There's a lot of good resources there.
Yeah,
where they can get a hold of you.
It'll give you a good feel for both book 1 and book 2, and it's just a small drop of a sample size that's in the actual book. And if you wanted to get a signed copy, you go over to the Buy Now page. If you're in the US, there's a US page. If you live in Canada, there's a Canada page. If you live anywhere else in the world, use the international page. If your credit card is declined, probably there's a security measure on it for international purchases. I live in Canada, so just call your credit card company, they'll take it off. You can also link over from those buy pages to get the digital version in Kindle, or it goes right to Amazon. And you can also link over to buy the book from Amazon or barnesandnoble.com. And amazon.ca. So, and when I have the links for the audiobooks, which first one will be out for book 1, hopefully by the end of June, and September for book 2, I'll put the links up on the website for that as well. So that's the best way to get a hold of me.
Well, we were talking about that earlier. The audiobook must be quite a feat getting that accomplished. So we're excited about seeing that done and getting a hold of that ourselves. Again, ladies and gentlemen, the link is in the description. And if you'd like to be a part of the extended conversation where we're going to talk about all these additional things, go to encountertoday.com and become a premium member, which helps us support the persecuted church around the world who we work with on a daily basis. Thank you for partnering with us. Gary Wayne, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Let's head on over to the premium side of things. We'll see you guys over at encountertoday.com.
If you believe we have crashed craft, stated earlier, do we have the bodies of the pilots who piloted this craft?
As I've stated publicly already in my News Nation interview, biologics came with some of these recoveries. Yeah.
Were they, I guess, human or non-human biologics?
He asked me point blank, have you read your Bible lately? And I said, well, sir, I think I know what it says. And he said, well, then you would know that these things are demonic.
And it turns out that actually, yes, these things have been shot down and crashed, and the U.S. government has the wreckage.
There's just no question that some of the reports seem to tell of the sort of thing that you find in poltergeist phenomena.
I mean, with artificial intelligence, we are summoning the demon.